Big Shaq sat alone in a McDonald's, nursing a cup of coffee, his body relaxed, enjoying the rare moment of peace. He'd been on edge for weeks, investigating cases that led him down dark paths, never quite finding solace. Today, he had promised himself a break, a small respite from his usually hectic life. No matter how much he tried to calm his mind, it seemed to buzz with thoughts of his past, his former life as a bodyguard and his transition into private investigation. But here, in this bustling, noisy fast food joint, the sounds of people laughing, ordering, and eating created an almost comforting white noise that masked the weight of his thoughts. But just as Shaq took another sip of his coffee, something stirred in the air, something subtle but unmistakable. He looked around, scanning the room, feeling an odd chill that didn't match the warm atmosphere. At a table near the corner, a small child, no older than 5, sat alone, his legs dangling from the chair. The child's eyes were fixed on Shaq, watching him intently. Shaq thought nothing of it at first, but the boy's gaze was piercing, almost unnerving. It felt as though the child knew him somehow, knew something about him. Then, without warning, the boy leaned forward, his small lips barely moving as he whispered, "They're coming for me. They're watching us." Shaq froze. His heart skipped a beat. His instincts, honed over years of bodyguard work, immediately kicked in. Every muscle in his body tensed, his senses sharpening. The room around him began to fade as he focused solely on the child. The boy's voice was soft, like a secret being passed between them, but the weight of the words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "They're coming for me." The child's eyes, wide and innocent, were filled with something far beyond his years, something familiar, a silent recognition of danger. The words echoed in Shaq's mind, cutting through the noise of the restaurant, their meaning clear yet cryptic. Shaq didn't need to think twice. His fingers reached instinctively for his phone, the number already dialed in his mind. Without even looking away from the boy, he pressed call. His thumb hovered over the green button, but something inside him hesitated. He glanced at the child again, whose wide, unblinking eyes never left him. Shaq knew that this wasn't just a random warning. There was something urgent about it, something he couldn't ignore. He hit the call button. 911, what's your emergency? Shaq's voice was calm but steady as he explained the situation, his words a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "There's a kid here, about 5 years old. He says he's being watched. I don't know what this means, but it's not normal." His hand tightened around the phone. "I think it's serious. I need someone here, now." The operator responded with professionalism but also skepticism, asking for more details. "Are you sure this is an emergency, sir? Maybe it's just a child making things up." Shaq's eyes narrowed as he glanced back at the boy, still sitting motionless at the table, his gaze never wavering. "Trust me. It's not just that. This kid knows something. I can feel it." The operator's tone softened, understanding the urgency in Shaq's voice. "All right, we'll send someone to check it out. Please stay on the line." Shaq's heart pounded, but he didn't move. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the child, watching every little motion the boy made. The boy remained eerily still, his hands folded in his lap. A flicker of recognition flashed in Shaq's mind. He had seen eyes like that before, eyes that had witnessed things no child should have to see. He thought back to the troubled kids he had helped in the past, their eyes speaking volumes about the horrors they had been through. Shaq's mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was clear: he had to do something. The whispers, the child's knowledge, this was no coincidence. The boy's warning felt like a tether, pulling Shaq into something much bigger than he could have imagined. Minutes passed, and Shaq continued to watch, his mind whirling with thoughts of what the boy might be trying to tell him. A part of him, the logical part, wanted to dismiss the child as simply imaginative, a little boy playing pretend. But Shaq's instincts told him otherwise. He knew that the world was filled with secrets, dark, dangerous secrets, and that children, in their innocence, often saw things that adults couldn't or wouldn't notice. This child wasn't just playing a game. Something was coming. Something dangerous. The door to McDonald's swung open, and a few officers entered, glancing around the room before settling their eyes on Shaq. The look in their eyes made it clear that they weren't taking him seriously. They were here because the 911 call had been made, but their demeanor suggested that they thought it was a false alarm, perhaps a misunderstanding or an overreaction. Shaq stood up, his imposing figure dwarfing the officers as he approached them. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The boy," he said, pointing to the table where the child still sat. "He's involved in something. You need to take him seriously." The officers exchanged skeptical glances but followed Shaq's lead to the boy's table. The child looked up at them, his small face calm but somehow knowing, as though he was prepared for this moment. The officer spoke gently, trying to be reassuring. "Hey, kiddo, everything okay?" The boy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked up at Shaq, as if waiting for some kind of permission. Shaq nodded slightly, and with that, the boy whispered again, his voice barely audible. "They're coming. I can't stay here anymore." The officer, sensing the weight in the boy's words, knelt down to his level. But before he could ask anything further, the boy's eyes flicked toward the door. He went still. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a split second, everyone in the restaurant held their breath. The sound of an engine revving outside broke the stillness. Shaq's pulse quickened. Something was happening. Without a word, Shaq reached for his phone again. "This is more than just a scared child," he muttered. "I need backup. Now." The officers seemed to understand the gravity of the situation at that moment. As they spoke into their radios, Shaq's mind was already piecing things together. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't just some misplaced fear. This was a warning. And whatever was coming, Shaq wasn't about to let it happen without a fight. Shaq's phone buzzed, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. The officers spoke to dispatch, their words lost in the background as Shaq's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding right in front of him. The boy's words echoed in his ears, and every moment that passed made the situation feel more urgent. He glanced back at the boy, whose wide eyes were fixed on the door, as if he could sense something approaching. The officers, still not fully grasping the gravity of the situation, tried to calm the boy down. "Hey, buddy, no need to be scared," one of them said, his tone soft but dismissive. "We're here to make sure you're safe." But the child didn't seem comforted. Instead, he shifted uneasily in his seat, looking around the room nervously. Shaq's stomach twisted. It was clear now that the boy was sensing something none of them could see. Shaq wasn't used to feeling this uncertain, but with every second that ticked by, the weight of the moment settled deeper into his chest. The boy looked up at Shaq, a strange glimmer of recognition flashing in his eyes. He leaned forward again, barely above a whisper. "They're coming for me. You need to stop them." Shaq nodded, his jaw tightening. The boy's warning was clear. This wasn't just about a child being scared of the unknown. This was something much darker, something that was already in motion. Shaq felt a surge of protective instinct rise within him, and he knew he couldn't let this go, not now. The situation was spiraling, and Shaq was already deep in it, whether the authorities realized it or not. "I need to take the boy with me," Shaq said, his voice firm. The officers exchanged confused looks but made no immediate move to stop him. The boy's wide eyes locked onto Shaq's once again. There was something about the way he looked at him, as though the child had seen the future. "You're the only one who can help," the boy whispered, the weight of his words sinking deep into Shaq's gut. Shaq turned to the officers. "This is bigger than you think. I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to find out. You're welcome to come with me, but I'm not waiting around here for more of this." The officers hesitated for a moment, but, seeing the urgency in Shaq's eyes, finally nodded. "Fine," one of them said reluctantly. "We'll go with you, but you need to explain more. Who are you, and why are you so sure this kid's in danger?" Shaq didn't have time for explanations. The boy's cryptic warnings had triggered something in him, something he hadn't felt in years, the need to protect. His instincts screamed that this was more than just a child's fantasy, more than a false alarm. As they exited the McDonald's, Shaq kept close to the boy, glancing over his shoulder at the officers, who were still trailing behind him but clearly out of their depth. Once outside, Shaq scanned the area. The air felt charged, the usual bustle of the street replaced by an unnerving stillness. He could sense that something wasn't right. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. The boy tugged at his sleeve, pulling him out of his thoughts. "They're watching us," the boy muttered, his voice trembling. Shaq glanced around again, instinctively reaching for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He could feel eyes on him, even though no one was visible. His heart pounded in his chest. Something was closing in on them, and he had no idea what it was. "Get in the car," Shaq ordered the officers, his voice low but urgent. "We need to move. Now." The officers climbed into the car, the boy following closely behind Shaq. As they sped away, Shaq tried to make sense of everything that had happened so far. The boy's words, the sense of impending danger, none of it made sense, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was unmistakable. The drive through the city felt endless, as if the streets were stretching out into an abyss. Shaq's mind kept racing, piecing together the fragments of the boy's cryptic message. "They're coming for me." It was a warning, but who were they? And why had the boy chosen him of all people to speak to? There was no way this was random. The boy shifted nervously in the back seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He seemed to be picking up on things Shaq couldn't. The boy muttered under his breath again. "They'll find us. They always do." Shaq turned to face the boy. "Who are they? What do you know?" The boy hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice small but filled with an unnerving certainty. "The people who took my family. They're still out there. They won't stop until they get me too." Shaq's stomach dropped. He had heard whispers of child trafficking rings, underground networks that preyed on the vulnerable, but he hadn't realized just how far-reaching they were. And now this boy, the one person who might know something crucial, was caught in the middle. Shaq turned back to the officers, who were now listening intently, their earlier skepticism replaced by a growing sense of concern. "We need to get this kid to safety," Shaq said, his voice gruff. "And we need to find out who's behind this before it's too late." One of the officers spoke up, his voice quiet but serious. "You think this is related to those missing children cases? The ones we've been investigating for the past few months?" Shaq's eyes narrowed. He didn't answer immediately, but the question lingered in his mind. This wasn't just about a missing child or a lone case, it was part of something bigger. And whatever that something was, it was closing in on them. The officers exchanged a look, and Shaq could tell that they were finally starting to understand the gravity of the situation. The boys' whispers continued, soft and cryptic, as they drove further into the city. Shaq's mind raced through the possibilities. There were too many unknowns. But one thing was clear, he couldn't let this boy out of his sight. Not now. Not ever. They were in this together, and no matter what it took, Shaq was going to protect him. Shaq's phone buzzed again, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on the boy and the growing realization that they were up against something far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. There was no turning back now. Shaq drove through the city with one hand gripping the wheel, the other clutching his phone as his mind whirled. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The boy's cryptic warnings, the strange sense of urgency in his voice, it was all too much to ignore. He could feel the tension building, pressing in from all sides, but there was no time to dwell on it. The officers in the back seat were starting to ask questions, their faces drawn with concern, but Shaq couldn't offer any answers. Not yet. He needed more information, something concrete to go on. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the boy began to speak again, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're always watching. They know everything about me." The words sent a chill through Shaq's bones. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but saw nothing that would indicate they were being followed. Yet, the unease didn't leave him. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Shaq pressed the gas pedal, his focus narrowing. He had to find out who they were these people the boy was so terrified of? The missing children cases had been growing in number, but nothing had pointed to any one group or individual. The authorities had kept the details tight, but it was clear now that whatever was happening was bigger than a few isolated kidnappings. There was an organized network at play, one that had been operating right under everyone's noses. The boy, sensing the growing tension, looked up at Shaq. "They'll find me. They always find me." Shaq's mind clicked into gear. "Who are they, kid? Who's after you?" The boy's lips trembled, but he remained silent for a long moment. Then, with a glance at the officers in the back seat, he spoke. "They're not just people. They're part of something bigger. They take kids like me. But I'm different." Shaq's heart skipped a beat. "Different how?" The boy seemed to consider this for a moment, then said, "I can see things. Things that haven't happened yet." His voice was quiet but filled with a strange, unshakable certainty. "I saw them before they took me. I saw everything." Shaq turned to the officers, who exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to process the boy's words. The idea that this child could somehow foresee the future was hard to believe, but in his line of work, he'd learned never to dismiss anything too quickly. Maybe the boy's different abilities weren't as far-fetched as they seemed. Whatever was going on, the kid was central to it. Shaq glanced at the boy again. "What did you see, kid? What do they want with you?" The boy hesitated before speaking again, his words slow and measured. "They wanted to use me. They wanted to make me like them. But I don't want to be like them. I can't." Shaq felt a surge of protectiveness. This was more than just a frightened child's imagination. The boy had witnessed something horrible. "We're going to stop them," Shaq said, his voice low and firm. "No one's going to hurt you. Not while I'm around." The boy nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't ease. Shaq's mind raced as they continued driving through the city, passing familiar landmarks that now felt like strange, foreign places. He could feel the presence of something lurking just out of sight, a dark shadow following them. The feeling was oppressive, like the air itself was thick with danger. They finally arrived at a rundown building on the edge of town, a place that seemed abandoned but was anything but. Shaq parked the car, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. He motioned for the officers to stay in the car while he took the boy inside. He needed to talk to the kid alone, away from prying eyes. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to take any chances. The building was dark and cold, the kind of place that felt like it had secrets hidden in every corner. Shaq led the boy through the empty halls, each step echoing in the silence. The boy was unusually calm now, almost too calm. It was as if he knew exactly where they were going. Shaq's unease grew with every step. This wasn't just a random hideout. It was a place that felt planned. And the boy knew it. They reached a small, dimly lit room in the back of the building. The boy stopped at the door, his small hand resting on the handle. "This is where they kept me," he said, his voice distant, like he was remembering something far away. Shaq's breath caught in his throat. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't just some abandoned warehouse. This was a location used for something much darker. The boy's warning rang in his mind. "They're coming for me." The walls seemed to close in around him as he processed the reality of what they were dealing with. This was no coincidence. This was deliberate. He pushed the door open, stepping into the room cautiously. Inside, it was empty except for a few old crates and a rusty chair in the center. But it didn't take long for Shaq to notice the faint markings on the walls, the scratches and symbols that looked like they had been carved in desperation. "What happened here?" Shaq asked, turning to the boy. The boy's eyes widened as he scanned the room, his face pale. "I didn't stay here long. But they tried to make me stay. They wanted me to see everything, to know everything. They said it would make me strong." His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, Shaq saw a flash of the terror that had been haunting him. "I didn't want to be like them." Shaq's anger flared. Whoever these people were, they had no right to do this to a child, no right to take away his innocence, to make him feel like he was part of something monstrous. The thought of what the boy had gone through made Shaq's blood boil. "I'm going to make sure they never hurt you again," Shaq said, his voice filled with conviction. The boy nodded, his eyes still haunted by the memories he couldn't escape. But as Shaq looked at him, something shifted in his mind. This wasn't just about protecting the boy anymore. This was about something bigger. The boy had been a target, but now, he had become the key to unraveling a network of horrors that had been operating in the shadows. Shaq had been drawn into this for a reason, and he wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. Shaq turned toward the door, his determination solidifying. He was in this for the long haul, and there was no turning back. Whoever was behind this, whoever had hurt this boy, was about to learn that Big Shaq was no longer just a former bodyguard. He was now a force to be reckoned with. And he wouldn't stop until he brought them all down. Shaq's mind was working at full speed as he left the building, the boy now by his side, his small hand gripping Shaq's sleeve like a lifeline. The strange, unsettling feeling from earlier hadn't left him. In fact, it had only grown stronger. There was no mistaking it now, they were being watched. He could feel eyes on him, though when he glanced around, there was nothing out of place. The city, so familiar just hours ago, felt foreign, almost hostile. Every corner seemed to hide something, and Shaq had no idea who or what it was. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not with the boy in tow. He needed to find out what was really going on, who was behind all of this, and he needed to do it fast. He glanced at the officers who were still waiting outside, their cars parked at a distance. They weren't much help. They'd listened to the boy's cryptic warnings, but their skepticism hadn't entirely dissolved. They were still treating this like a case of an overactive imagination. They had no idea what they were dealing with. And Shaq couldn't waste time trying to convince them. The boy's voice interrupted his thoughts. "They're coming. They're closer now." Shaq turned to the child, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't been hearing things. There was something about this boy, something otherworldly. He wasn't just a victim, he was a key. And somehow, everything led back to the boy. Every piece of the puzzle, every step forward Shaq took, seemed to bring him closer to the truth about the child and the people after him. Shaq placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "We're not letting anyone get to you. Not while I'm here." The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "They'll try. They always do. But you have to stop them. They're too strong." "Who are they?" Shaq's voice was sharper now, his patience thinning. He needed answers. "Who's behind all this?" The boy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared off into the distance, as if lost in thought, before speaking again. "They're not like regular people. They've been here for a long time. They have money. Power. And they use it to take kids like me. They make them forget. They make them do things." Shaq's stomach turned. The idea that a group with such power could be operating in the shadows, right under everyone's noses, was terrifying. But the boy's words hinted at something even darker. Memory manipulation. That wasn't something any regular criminal organization could pull off. This was bigger, far bigger, than just a few missing children. Shaq's mind raced. If these people could manipulate memories, control the minds of children, then they were dealing with something much more dangerous than he had originally thought. These were no ordinary criminals. This was a sophisticated, covert operation that had managed to stay hidden for far too long. The boy continued. "They tried to take me. But I escaped. I saw them before they took me. I know what they're doing. And I know what they're going to do next." Shaq's heart raced. He needed to know everything. Now. The boy had seen the future, his own future. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a race against time. "What are they going to do next?" Shaq's voice was urgent. "Tell me, and we can stop it." The boy met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something more than fear. It was defiance. "They're going to take more of us. But this time, it's different. They're not just taking kids. They're using them. For something bigger. Something dangerous. Shaq felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Whatever they were planning, it was beyond his understanding. But he knew one thing for certain: the boy was the key to everything. He couldn't let them get to him. Not now. Not ever. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine roared in the distance, breaking Shaq's train of thought. He turned to look, his instincts kicking in. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was out there, waiting. He could feel it. He turned back to the boy. "Stay close," Shaq said, his voice low and steady. He wasn't about to let his guard down. Not now. They started walking back toward the car, but the boy's hand tugged at his sleeve again. "They're coming. You can't outrun them." Shaq's pulse quickened. The boy's warning had an edge of certainty to it, like he knew exactly what was coming. But Shaq wasn't the type to back down from a fight. Not now, not when so much was at stake. "We don't need to outrun them," Shaq said, his voice filled with resolve. "We just need to outsmart them." The boy nodded, though his expression remained anxious. Shaq could tell that despite the boy's calm exterior, he was scared. The people after him were ruthless, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. And Shaq knew that what they wanted most was the boy, his knowledge, his ability to see what was coming. As they approached the car, Shaq's eyes scanned the streets, looking for any signs of movement. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. The officers were still waiting, but Shaq wasn't sure how much help they'd be. They had barely grasped the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a case of missing children or random kidnappings. This was an operation, a well-oiled machine that had been running for years. And Shaq was right in the middle of it now. The engine noise grew louder. Shaq tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the door handle. The car wasn't safe, not yet. But there was no turning back now. They couldn't just sit and wait to be found. Shaq needed to take action. "Get in the car. We need to move. Now." The officers scrambled to get inside, their faces pale with concern. Shaq kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning the area for anything out of place. He could feel the tension building, the sense that something was coming to a head. They had to leave. Fast. As they sped away from the area, Shaq couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours. He was no longer just a bodyguard. He was a man on a mission, one that could change everything. He had no idea what he was up against, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to stop until he found out who was behind this, and he wasn't going to let anyone hurt the boy. The boy's words echoed in his mind as they drove through the streets. "They're too strong. You can't stop them." Shaq's grip tightened on the wheel. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He wasn't just fighting for the boy. He was fighting for something bigger. Something that could change the world as they knew it. And no matter how dark it got, Shaq was ready to see it through to the end. The car sped down the empty street, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Shaq's eyes never left the road, his mind constantly racing. Every passing moment felt heavier. The boy in the back seat was silent, his small hands clutched tightly around his knees, his gaze fixed out the window. It was as though he knew what was coming, as if he could already see the end. Shaq's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had to act fast. There wasn't much time left. "Where are we headed?" one of the officers asked, breaking the silence. His voice was tense, unsure, as if he wasn't sure who or what to trust anymore. Shaq didn't take his eyes off the road. "We need to get to the safe house. We can't risk staying in the city any longer." The officer nodded, but Shaq could feel the skepticism in the air. They still didn't understand the gravity of the situation. They didn't see what he saw, the way the boy's warnings had lined up with everything they'd uncovered so far. This wasn't just a missing child case anymore. This was something much deeper. The boy wasn't just a victim, he was the key to stopping whatever was happening. But there was more to the boy than anyone had realized. Shaq glanced in the rearview mirror at the boy again. "You're sure they're coming for you, right?" The boy met his gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Shaq saw something different, something fierce, determined. It was a side of the boy that had been buried beneath the layers of fear and confusion. "I know they're coming," the boy replied softly. "They've always come for me. But this time, I'm not going to let them take me again." Shaq felt a surge of something, pride maybe. The boy had been through hell, but he was still fighting. He wasn't giving up. Neither was Shaq. "Good," Shaq muttered. "We'll make sure of it." The tension in the car was palpable. The officers in the back were exchanging uneasy glances, but no one said anything. They were all out of their depth. They hadn't seen what Shaq had seen, the dark, dangerous underbelly of the world, hidden in plain sight. They had no idea what they were dealing with. But Shaq did. And he wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, stand in his way. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the tires on the road the only sound. Shaq's mind continued to race, trying to piece together the fragments of information he'd gathered. The boy's words, about people who could manipulate memories, who could control children, had been disturbing, but Shaq couldn't dismiss them. They were connected to the missing children cases he'd been investigating for months. And now, the boy was at the center of it all. He thought back to the symbols on the walls in the abandoned building. The strange markings had been carved with urgency, desperation. It was clear that someone had been trying to leave a message, a warning, before they were taken. And it was no coincidence that the boy had led them to that very spot. Shaq's mind flashed back to something the boy had said earlier. "They tried to make me forget. They wanted me to be like them." The boy's words had haunted him, and they still did. Whoever they weren't ordinary criminals. They were something else entirely. Powerful, manipulative, and dangerous. His thoughts were interrupted when the boy spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. They won't stop. They've been looking for me for a long time. And when they find me, it won't end well." Shaq's jaw clenched. He wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. "We're not going to let that happen. I won't let them take you. You're safe now." The boy looked at him, his expression softening just a little. "I don't think you can stop them. They're everywhere." Shaq's heart raced. He had to be strong, for the boy's sake. He couldn't let him see the doubt that was creeping into his own mind. The boy's words were too certain, too calm. This wasn't just a child's fear. This was something that ran deeper, something he couldn't yet understand. "Trust me," Shaq said, his voice firm. "We'll stop them. I promise." He knew he had to find out more, dig deeper. But the information was scattered, fragmented. The missing children cases were connected, yes, but there was something larger at play, something that no one had put together yet. These kidnappings were part of a bigger plan, something sinister that had been operating for far too long. The car turned onto a quiet street, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Shaq pulled up to the nondescript building that would serve as their temporary safe house. It wasn't much, a few rooms, a single entrance, and a whole lot of nothing, but it was enough for now. It was hidden, isolated. Safe. Shaq parked the car, his eyes scanning the area. He didn't trust it. Something about this place felt too calm, too quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But they had to stay here for now. They didn't have a choice. "Get out," Shaq said, his voice low. "And stay close." The officers climbed out of the car, still looking confused but willing to follow Shaq's lead. The boy followed Shaq without a word, his small form moving quickly in the shadows. They moved inside the building, and Shaq immediately went to work, securing the doors, checking the windows. There was no way to know how much time they had, but he wasn't about to take any chances. As he worked, the boy sat down on an old chair in the corner of the room, his legs drawn up to his chest. He looked so small, so vulnerable. Shaq couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. This kid, this child, was caught in something much larger than anyone had anticipated. He was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, of everything Shaq had failed to protect. But not anymore. Not while Shaq was still breathing. The officers were talking in low voices in the other room, probably making their own plans, trying to figure out what to do next. But Shaq knew that it was up to him. He was the only one who truly understood the danger they were in. The boys' warnings, the cryptic messages, it was all part of a larger puzzle, one that he had to solve before it was too late. He couldn't let them take this boy. Not again. As he moved around the room, securing the locks, checking the windows, the boy's voice cut through the silence. "They'll find us. They always do." Shaq stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He turned to the boy, his expression hardening. "Not this time. Not while I'm here." The boy met his gaze, his eyes tired but resolute. "You don't understand. They're always watching. Always." Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what he had to do. And whatever it took, he was going to make sure they never hurt this boy again. He was going to end this, once and for all. Shaq paced back and forth in the dimly lit room, his mind working furiously. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. The quiet hum of the old building seemed to echo louder with each passing second. Time was slipping away, and every instinct Shaq had honed over years of protection and investigation told him that they weren't safe here. Not for long. The boy sat quietly in the corner, his eyes downcast, lost in his own thoughts. Shaq could feel the weight of his silence, the fear still hanging in the air like a thick fog. He couldn't help but feel responsible for this kid now, even more than before. The boy had been through so much already, and yet, the worst was still to come. Shaq wasn't going to let them take him again. He couldn't. The officers were in the next room, still trying to make sense of everything, still unsure of how deep this went. They were trying to organize, to plan, but Shaq could tell that they weren't prepared for what was coming. He was the only one who truly understood the threat. The boys' warnings weren't just vague ramblings. They were truths. Uncomfortable, terrifying truths. Shaq turned toward the boy, who hadn't spoken in what felt like an eternity. "You were right," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of frustration. "I don't know who these people are, but I'm starting to see that they're bigger than I thought." The boy finally looked up, his eyes filled with an understanding far beyond his years. He nodded slowly, as if accepting something he already knew. "They've been looking for me," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I'm different. I can see them. I can feel them. And they want me because of what I know." Shaq's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about some criminal network anymore. This was about something much more powerful, more insidious. "What do they want from you?" he asked, his voice low. The boy hesitated before speaking again, his voice trembling slightly. "They want me to show them how to control it. How to control people's minds." The weight of the words hung heavily in the air, each one sinking deep into Shaq's chest. Mind control. That was the weapon. The real reason these people were targeting children. The boy wasn't just a victim of kidnapping, he was a tool. A key. Shaq clenched his fists. He had to stop them. There was no other choice. He had to stop them before they could use this power to destroy more lives. The boy spoke again, this time with more conviction. "You can't stop them just by running. They're everywhere. They know everything." Shaq nodded, his mind already planning. "I'm not running, kid. We're going to take the fight to them. You're not going to be their puppet. Not while I'm still breathing." The boy didn't respond, but the tension in the air between them shifted. It was as though he had finally accepted that Shaq was going to protect him, that they were in this together, no matter how impossible it seemed. Shaq turned to the door and walked over to the small table in the corner of the room where the officers had left a few scattered files. He flipped through them quickly, his eyes scanning the documents. Missing children. Multiple cases from across the city, all of them tied together by something vague, some invisible thread. But now, he could see the connection clearly. This wasn't just about kidnapped children, it was about power. And these people were willing to do anything to get it. "They're not just kidnapping kids," Shaq muttered to himself. They're using them. They're turning them into something else. The boy looked up at him, his eyes sharp, his voice steady. They want to create an army. An army of kids like me, kids who can see things, kids who can control minds. Shaq's blood ran cold. This was more than just a criminal operation. This was an attempt to create an army of controlled, manipulated children. Children who could be forced to do anything. He felt sick just thinking about it. He grabbed his phone, dialing a number without hesitation. "It's time," he said when the line picked up. "We need everything we can get. We need intel on everyone involved in these disappearances. Every last one of them." The voice on the other end responded quickly, but Shaq barely heard it. He was too focused on the plan that was forming in his mind. There was no room for error. He needed to hit them hard, to take down the entire network in one swift blow. If he didn't, they would continue to operate in the shadows, and more kids, more innocent lives, would be lost. As he hung up the phone, Shaq turned back to the boy. "We're going after them," he said, his voice cold and determined. "I don't care who they are, where they're hiding. We're going to bring them down." The boy nodded again, but Shaq could see the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. He was scared. But Shaq could see that the boy was also ready. He was ready to fight back, to stop the people who had stolen his childhood and used him as a pawn. The next few hours passed in a blur of planning, preparation, and tension. Shaq and the officers worked together, piecing together the information they had, making phone calls, tracking down leads. But deep down, Shaq knew that they were still missing something. They had no idea where to find the heart of the operation. They didn't know where the real danger lay. It wasn't until Shaq looked at the boy again that he realized the truth. The boy had seen it all. He was the one who knew where the operation was hidden, who knew the people behind it. Shaq couldn't do this without him. "We're going to end this," Shaq said, his eyes locked with the boy's. "But we're doing it together. You have what they want. And we're going to use it against them." The boy nodded solemnly, the weight of the situation finally settling into his small frame. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He wasn't just a frightened child. He was their best chance at stopping the people who had been pulling the strings. Shaq took a deep breath. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were going to fight back. And they were going to win. As Shaq prepared for the final showdown, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't just protecting the boy anymore. He was fighting for a future where children like him would never again be used as weapons. Where no one would ever have to endure what the boy had gone through. Shaq was ready. And no matter what it took, he was going to make sure they never hurt this child, or anyone else, again. The night was heavy with anticipation, the quiet tension in the air thick and suffocating. Shaq stood at the makeshift command center, his eyes scanning the documents, the map, the tangled web of information that had led him to this point. It had taken everything he had, his connections, his skills, his relentless drive, to get to the heart of the operation. He knew they were close. They were on the cusp of bringing everything crashing down, but the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about saving the boy anymore. This was about stopping a force that had been operating in the shadows for far too long, a force that had the power to tear lives apart with no remorse. The boy was sitting in the corner again, watching, waiting. He had been quiet for a while now, but there was an understanding between them. Shaq could see it in the boy's eyes, a mix of fear and resolve. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was a survivor, and Shaq wasn't about to let him become a victim again. Shaq took a deep breath, shaking off the exhaustion that had been creeping up on him. There was no time for rest. They had one shot at this. If they failed now, if they didn't strike hard and fast, everything they had worked for would be in vain. The boy had led them this far, but it was up to Shaq to finish it. It was up to him to make sure they didn't slip through their fingers again. He turned to the officers who had been working alongside him. They were ready, but Shaq could see the doubt in their eyes. They hadn't seen what he had seen. They hadn't lived through the years of dealing with criminals who operated in the dark, the ones who believed they were untouchable. They hadn't seen the way the boy's eyes had flickered with the knowledge of things no one should ever have to know. Shaq clenched his jaw, his gaze flicking to the boy once more. He wasn't about to let this end in failure. "We're going in fast," Shaq said, his voice low but steady. "No hesitation. We hit them where it hurts. We take everything they've built and burn it to the ground." The officers nodded, a mixture of determination and uncertainty in their eyes. But Shaq wasn't concerned about their doubts. They had to do this, and they had to do it now. There was no room for error. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, the boy's fate, the fate of every other child who had been taken. He couldn't afford to fail. He looked at the boy, who met his gaze without flinching. Shaq could see the boy was ready. He was ready to fight for himself, to take back control of his life. And Shaq was going to make sure he had that chance. "We end this tonight," Shaq said, his voice unwavering. The officers moved to their positions, gathering their gear, making final preparations. Shaq didn't need to tell them more. They understood. This wasn't just a raid, it was a mission. A mission to take down the organization that had been exploiting children, using them as pawns in their twisted game of power. They were no longer just fighting to protect one child. They were fighting to end this. To ensure no other child would ever be used like this again. The boy stayed close to Shaq as they moved toward the exit. He was smaller, but he carried a weight in his presence, a knowledge far beyond his years. Shaq could tell that he was still afraid, but there was something else there too, something fierce. Something that told Shaq this wasn't just about survival. This was about taking back power, taking back control. As they made their way out, Shaq's mind replayed every step they had taken to get here. Every piece of information they had uncovered, every clue the boy had given them, it had all led to this moment. But it was still too soon to celebrate. They weren't out of the woods yet. The hardest part was still to come. They arrived at the location, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It didn't look like much, but Shaq knew better than to judge by appearances. This place was the heart of the operation. This is where it all came together. They moved quickly, silently, their steps calculated. Shaq's hand rested on the boy's shoulder, offering a sense of calm in the storm. The boy didn't need reassurance, not really, but Shaq gave it anyway. It was a small act, but it meant everything. It was a promise, he wouldn't let the boy down. The team split up, taking different routes to surround the building. Shaq, with the boy in tow, moved toward the entrance. They were close now, closer than they had ever been. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the weight of the plan pressing on him. There was no turning back now. They were too deep, too committed. As they reached the entrance, Shaq signaled the officers to move into position. They were all set. The boy looked up at Shaq, his expression calm but serious. He knew what was at stake. Shaq took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready?" The boy didn't respond with words, but the look in his eyes said everything. He was ready. Shaq kicked open the door, the sound reverberating through the empty hall. The operation was in full swing now. The criminals inside didn't know it yet, but their world was about to come crashing down. Shaq moved swiftly, taking out the first few men who were in the way. The officers followed closely behind, securing the perimeter, taking down anyone who tried to resist. It wasn't long before they reached the central area, the heart of the operation. The leader was there, waiting, as if he had been expecting them. Shaq's jaw clenched as he locked eyes with the man. This was it. This was the person who had caused so much pain, who had exploited so many lives for his own gain. "End of the line," Shaq said, his voice cold as ice. The man sneered, but Shaq wasn't fazed. He had dealt with men like this before, men who thought they were untouchable. This man's reign of terror was over. The boy stood behind Shaq, watching, waiting. Shaq could feel his presence, the quiet strength that radiated from him. The boy wasn't just a survivor. He was a warrior in his own right. And together, they were going to make sure this nightmare came to an end. As the final confrontation unfolded, Shaq's focus never wavered. Every move, every decision, every action was calculated. The boy's eyes never left the action, his understanding of the situation as sharp as ever. The criminals were no match for them. One by one they fell. When it was finally over, Shaq stood in the middle of the room, his chest heaving with exertion. The boy was beside him, quiet, but Shaq could feel the weight of his relief. They had done it. They had taken down the network, the operation that had been tearing lives apart for years. Shaq turned to the boy, offering him a rare smile. "You did it," he said. "We did it." The boy looked up at him, his face softening just slightly. "It's over," he whispered. "It's really over." Shaq nodded, the weight of their victory settling in. This was just the beginning. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The boy was free. And the world was a little bit safer. For now, that was all that mattered.